Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, where this week we're facing up to facial recognition.
More specifically, we're looking at the world of biometric security. If you bought a new phone at any point in the last 5 years, there's a pretty good chance it includes built-in security features that let you unlock your device, sign into apps, and even pay for things by scanning your face or fingerprint. This kind of biometric authentication has been tipped as the next big thing in the worlds of both consumer and business security, but so far it hasn't quite taken hold.
This week, we're talking about why that is and what the future of biometric security could hold. Joining us is Steve Furnell, Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Nottingham and Senior Member of the IEEE. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, what is the current state of biometric security adoption in the UK?
So from my perspective, I can see a growing increase in the adoption of biometrics in the UK, particularly on the basis of what you already said as part of the introduction, our increasing encounters with them in the context of our smartphone devices and our other bits of mobile technology. That's been a particular growth area in terms of biometrics of some form being built into these devices by default. And so, in a sense, whether we're looking to buy that technology or not, we're getting it as standard as part of these devices. And over the last few years, more and more of those devices have been getting that provision. So not just the high-end models of devices, which you might have seen in previous years.
So what about in business? So this is a big thing in the consumer market. Payment apps and some social media platforms, for example, will allow you to sign in with biometric authentication. But so far, it doesn't seem to have become as prevalent in the world of business as it has perhaps in consumer. Is that fair?
So I think part of the reason that we might not be seeing quite so much of it in a business context is because if somebody's providing us with a service that we're being asked to access, they can't necessarily at this stage rely on us having a device that has biometric provision built into it. So although they're becoming far more prevalent, it's still not a case that every end user, every customer of a service can be assumed to have something with that capability. And of course, we only tend to have that capability at the moment on our mobile devices. We're not having it by default, even on laptops, and certainly not on desktop devices. So it's not as prevalent in the other spaces as we're seeing on smartphones.
Is there an element there possibly also of cost? So as you pointed out, on consumer devices, it tends to be built in. Like you get the phone, you get the biometric security, it's one little package. Whereas for anything that companies might want to do, say you do want to enforce your employees logging into their laptops via an external biometric security, a thumb scanner or whatever, that's going to be an additional cost to the companies, and there must be a cost benefit analysis going on there.
Absolutely. I think if you're thinking about deploying biometrics via devices that don't have them natively, then yes, you are introducing an additional unit cost, particularly with something like fingerprint recognition, and also perhaps an element of then inconvenience for the user. If you've got a separate device that you've got to carry around with you, if it's connecting to a laptop sort of as a dongle, you might then end up with somebody taking their laptop elsewhere without the reader device, so then find themselves unable to do what they wanted. So I think where you've got the device built in, it's far more able to be leveraged. And particularly if we're thinking about biometrics like face recognition, which to some degree, at least 2D face recognition, you can do via a standard webcam, then that sort of capability is built into many of the devices we use. Unfortunately, with that particular technology, 2D face recognition, it's not up to the level of security that we might want in order to actually be granting access.
So speaking of that level of security, let's talk about the relationship between biometric authentication and, traditional complex passwords. Is one really better than the other?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by better. Certainly from my perspective, using biometrics is a far better experience than using a complex password. For a start, the biometric authentication can be done in less than half a second on most of the types of devices we're now using. There's no wait time unless it's failed to capture a sample, etc. Whereas with a complex password, and particularly with my typing, and particularly if I'm doing it on a small screen, then that could be quite a few seconds in the process and a bit of repetition if I get it wrong. And so I think the level of security you could get from complex passwords could be comparable if you have a password particularly that's long enough and complex enough, but the biometric makes it far easier for you to do the authentication.
I feel you on that particular answer. Yeah, there are plenty of passwords that I've got that are just ideal for when I created them on my laptop or my desktop, and then I'm there with my smartphone basically cursing past Jane for having made such a nice secure password that's taking roughly forever to put into my whatever app it is that I'm using.
On that note, I have to say that the adoption of biometric security by password management products and password vaults and the like is one of the most convenient implementations of it I've seen, because it's so much more convenient to be able to log into your password manager with biometrics and then bypass the biometrics and all of that kind of stuff for every other kind of subsequent service.
Yes, and that integration of biometrics into the process, to improve the usability, the user experience side of things, is quite often where it's playing a part now. As you mentioned, we're in many cases still using services that are actually using the password as the basis for the authentication. That's what's the authenticating you, let's say, to the website or to the app service that you're using. But your biometric sensor on your local device is triggering the access to the password manager to retrieve and populate what you're using. So the user experience is, I'm using biometrics. The reality is it's masking out actually you're using a password. And that really, just as a sort of follow-on thought from that, is also the case in terms of the mobile devices, the smartphones that we're using the biometrics themselves on. They are still not the master technique that we're using. If your biometric acquisition fails, you'll notice it drops back through to asking you for a password, a passcode, whatever the terminology is that matches your underlying approach. I'm sure we've all encountered that happening far more frequently in the lockdown period when we've been trying to, for example, use, or those of us using face recognition on our smartphones with half your face covered. It doesn't work.
Yeah. Is it the case then, when we think about this, that biometric security is basically a seamless two-factor authentication method, that you put your thumb or your finger on the reader and it does that two-step process, but you just don't see it because it's happening 1-2 straight ahead of each other, rather than previously having to use an RSA token or a card reader if you're trying to get into your bank account, or all those kinds of things?
So if it's happening on a device that you possess, then sort of, because actually what you as the user are doing is an alternative to providing the password in that particular case. So your factor that you're actually interacting with and providing to the system is your biometric, and then it's providing the password on your behalf. So you're still only proving one element of it. You're not proving that you, the user, knew the password. You're proving that you can supply the biometric in that particular case. If you're supplying it via a device that only that user would have, then it's the possession of the device and the biometric that's essentially authenticating you.
Yeah.
So one implementation of biometrics that we've seen as part of that kind of wider multi-factor security strategy, if you like, although that is a little bit of a word salad, is the use of biometrics in relation to behavioral analysis, particularly in kind of enterprise security. So, the system will look at all the factors, things like where you're logging in from, what time you're logging in at, what device you're on, and decide what level of security to ask of you, whether that's kind of just username and password or biometrics or kind of like an SMS authentication code or any combination of the above. But with that in mind, where would you put biometrics in terms of relative security? So, for example, would you say that biometric authentication is a greater indicator of security than a username and password?
So it rather depends on what biometric and how it's been implemented. But in broad terms, yes, it can often be better than that because you're using something that is more specific to that individual and something that is less easy for them particularly to have compromised or to have compromised on their behalf. So even if, for example, biometric data that's stored somewhere is harvested in the same way as passwords, it's then less easy for somebody to take that information and redeploy it in the manner that they would otherwise do with a password. If you've got a cracked password, you can just use it. There's no further barrier to entry.
You can't copy and paste a fingerprint.
No, you've got to go to some effort, even if you've got the information, to create a suitable sample that you can then present to a device in order to be authenticated. Unless you've got some compromise in the actual implementation that would just allow you to play an equivalent sample electronically through it. But again, that would be very implementation dependent and would rely on a poor implementation having been done.
And I suppose the argument as well is if every biometric system has a password-based fallback, it's usually going to be easier for an attacker to crack that rather than the biometric piece.
And that's something that I think we're perhaps in many user cases still potentially overlooking. So people are now using their device and think, I've got stronger authentication because it's recognizing my face or my fingerprint, etc., but perhaps still not having given as much thought as they needed to into, well, what's the passcode or the password that's protecting that device? So again, on our mobile devices, if we think about what the baseline requirement is for a passcode, so if I remember correctly, it's still a minimum 6-digit or 6-character passcode that's required. So you can get away with a 6-digit PIN, actually based on numbers. So there's no barrier to people doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which happens to be the most common passcode that tends to get used anyway. And so you've got all that visible potential security around the biometric, but actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the only realistic barrier between the attacker and getting access to the device.
So with that in mind, would you say that biometrics in its current kind of implementation is more about convenience and speed of logging in than about actually making devices and services more secure?
Yes and no. It absolutely is about convenience, but as a consequence of having made it convenient, you've also actually raised the bar for security as well. So if you think about, again, your smartphone device and how you may have protected it or not in the past, when you didn't have biometrics there as an option, I think it was very likely for many people that they would have a PIN on the device or a passcode, even a more complex password, but it wouldn't be something that they would have activating every time they turn the device off and on or put into standby. Rather, so you take it out, have to authenticate, turn it off, put it back in your pocket, then remember that you didn't do something. That becomes quite inconvenient with entering passcodes all the time. And so people would have it set up that it would only ask for it after 15 minutes of inactivity or something like this. Whereas with a biometric, you can have it that whenever you take the device out of your pocket and try to use it, it can request the biometric because what is it for you? Half a second's worth of effort to actually do it. You might, with face recognition, need to move it up and show the camera your face. You might, with fingerprint recognition, need to make sure you're putting your thumb or finger on the right part to be sensed, but that's not very much effort compared to fumbling around trying to type in a code.
So we've spoken a bit about the two most common kinds of biometric security that you really come across every day at the moment. So fingerprint recognition versus facial recognition. Do either of those have an advantage over the other?
It rather depends how you've implemented them. So from a security perspective, I suppose as the baseline, 2-dimensional face recognition would be the least secure because it's something that is more potentially prone to being compromised. You're only looking at basically a flat image of the user's face. Then you've got fingerprint recognition implemented in a standard way, and then 3-dimensional face recognition ought to be that bit more secure than fingerprints, at least in the figures quoted by a leading manufacturer that has different options on their devices. So they would quote the facial recognition technique as being the more secure because it's using a 3D image of the user's face. I think from the perspective of the user experience, again, it very much depends on where you are and what you're doing. So again, thinking about the context we faced during the pandemic, having to wear face masks, facial recognition has become fundamentally more challenging during that period, whereas people using fingerprint recognition on their devices have been quite happily able to carry on just as they normally would. If you think about different scenarios, so in the rain, for example, or in the cold when you've got gloves on or something like this, or your sensor on the device is wet, fingerprint recognition doesn't work anywhere near so well as it does under normal conditions. If you're here in the winter in the UK, having to take your gloves off to provide your fingerprint sample is rather less usable than typing in even the PIN or password.
Absolutely. So something that we haven't discussed so far is privacy. It's one of the key concerns that has arisen in relation to biometrics. We've run plenty of stuff on the site on exactly this. What considerations do businesses need to take into account if they're going to implement biometrics? For example, facial recognition as somebody comes into the office.
So I think one of the considerations is where and how is that data being stored? So certainly you want that data to be stored very securely. You want it encrypted. So you don't want the biometric information to be able to be replayed such that a sample that's captured at one point could be repeatedly offered to the system. So you need some sort of evidencing that it's a fresh sample. Ideally, what you want is the biometric information to remain with the user and for their device to provide an attestation that they are the correct person. So that's what we're getting with the mobile devices. For example, typically the biometric information is not leaving the device at all, and apps and other things that are looking for the confirmation of authentication, they're not getting access to the biometric data either. They're getting a confirmation that the user has passed authentication. So it would be preferable to implement things in as close to that mode as we can. If biometric data is compromised, as I mentioned earlier, it still requires more effort to make use of it than, let's say, standard secret knowledge, password-based information, but equally, passwords and other secret knowledge can be changed. Biometrics, obviously, you've got a limit in terms of, let's say, fingerprint recognition. You've got up to 10 options there that you as an individual can use, and you've only got the one face, unless you're particularly dishonest. And even that doesn't help you in a biometric context. So, yeah, fundamentally, we want to safeguard that information.
So, are potential privacy considerations holding biometrics back from being more widely deployed than they currently are? Like, for example, are businesses perhaps not pursuing biometrics as actively as they could because they don't want to have to deal with all these overheads in terms of making sure that the data is kind of securely stored and processed and isn't likely to be a risk factor?
I think that's likely to be the case. And again, I suppose we've got evidence of why they might want to be concerned about it, given all the breaches and the leaks of password databases, etc., that we regularly see happening over the years. So for an organization to take responsibility for that sort of data for their user community, you can see why they wouldn't want to. And indeed, it would be far preferable to have a solution that doesn't require them to. So again, you're not getting them to store the biometric data. You're getting something to confirm that a biometric test has been passed and using that.
Mm. So one of the concerns that opponents of biometric security raise is the fact that, as you say, you only have one face and 10 fingerprints. And if those details are compromised and, the data behind them, if you like, is compromised, then you can't really change it in the same way that you can change a password, for example. Is this a risk that we have to bear in mind when developing biometric security solutions?
It is a risk, and it's one of the reasons, again, why the storage of the data becomes important. But equally, again, going back to that point about how easily it is, or how easy it is rather, to compromise a biometric compared to a password, it takes a lot more effort. So it's easy to find evidence of when biometrics were first introduced on mobile devices and when successive implementations were released. Very quickly you get reports of, some group has managed to compromise it, it's been broken, etc. They fooled it and got past the authentication. But then you read the details of what they've needed to do in order to do that. So creating fake fingerprints, creating 3D masks of the user's face, and being able to pass liveness detection tests, it's non-trivial compared to the ease of compromising somebody's password, which, to be honest, we see it from phishing attacks and from other forms of social engineering. Quite often it can be as little as almost just asking them what their password is and finding a way to get it from them, or indeed the other sort of breaches that we see with key logging and with bulk compromises as well. So the bar is at a different point. But as you say, if it's compromised, it's far more of a fundamental problem then for the user who's affected.
So presumably it would need to be a very high value target if you were going to go to those lengths to try and compromise it. And at that point, realistically, if you just turn a computer on the target and get it to run loads of passwords, it'll probably take you less time and effort. And you can have a coffee in the meantime.
It's, it comes back to that thing that we've discussed a number of times on the podcast about the path of least resistance when it comes to security. You don't have to outrun the lion, you just have to outrun the other guy. So then is this an argument for saying that biometrics should never be deployed kind of in isolation, like as the sole kind of authentication piece of your security strategy?
I think they work far better as part of an integrated solution. So having a complete dependence on them becomes a risk in itself. The way I would see it as being preferable is they are used as that usability shield for us. So we've got other elements of security that are in play, but the bit that is user facing and smoothing the process for us, making it less intrusive, reducing the friction, whatever terms you want to use for it, that's the bit where it's had, I think, the most effective role to play so far.
So, Steve, what does the future hold for biometric security? Is it going to be the way forward, or will it just be used for accessing our private personal devices from now on?
I suspect we're going to see more of it. We're going to see more of it in those personal devices, and it's going to become more and more expected to see this. I think increasingly it's going to feel out of place, anachronistic for people to be expected to type passwords and do things like this on other devices and in other systems when they're so used to using biometrics and having a smooth, transparent, quick process to logging in, accessing, approving things on mobile devices. So I suspect we're going to see more, not less. I think that the types of biometrics that we're going to see may well evolve. As the technology costs come down, we're going to see more devices at least having the option to use the stronger techniques. Although even now, you see a little bit of, I suppose, conflict between almost the aesthetics of the devices. Again, thinking about the smartphones in particular and how you would integrate biometrics. So as we see with the smartphones, there's this battle to get bigger and bigger screens and having less of a bezel around the edge and not having the notches that you see at the top of some of the displays that are housing the camera technologies. That's already led to some biometric techniques that were introduced on some generations of devices. So, for example, iris recognition was there on some devices for a period of time. That's now disappeared in order to reclaim that bit of the screen that the iris sensors needed to sit within. And I think similarly, we saw a bit of a departure from using fingerprint recognition on the front of devices because the fingerprint sensor was taking up space. But now we've got in-display technologies so that you can do fingerprint recognition through the rest of the display rather than having to have a separate area segmented off for the sensor. So what I think we've seen over the last couple of decades, essentially, is biometrics moving from being something that people have heard about to something that they're now regularly using. So in a sense, they've gone from being almost the magical technology that you see in the movies and in science fiction to being something that is regular and perhaps almost mundane from the user's perspective. But I think equally, it's now something that's going to be actually more expected. It's because it's become in and of itself, that technology, its presence is almost invisible to us. It's going to be even more noticeable when we don't have it there available to us.
Mm. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this week's episode, but our thanks once again to Steve Furnell from the University of Nottingham for joining us.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to never miss an episode. And we'll be back next week with more analysis from the world of IT. And until then, goodbye.
Bye. The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.